I'm Adam Jennings, and this is Awaiting Approval, a podcast about the messy, human side of creative leadership.
Today I'm joined by Charmaine Wyland, user-focused design leader, Ex-Gumtree, Just Eat, Expedia, SapientRazorfish and many more, for a relaxed, two-way conversation about her journey, the lessons she's learned, and what it's taken to lead with creativity and honesty.
Charmaine, hi, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this chat.
Likewise. As always, I'd like to start this off with a light question and a chance for listeners to get to know you a little bit better. So if we were recording this in person today, if we were going to meet up to record this, where would you suggest we meet and what would you order to drink?
So for this, I think a lot of it really depends on how candid and how deep in the weeds and deep into the muck we're going to get. So if we're really going to have a very honest conversation, it would probably be a quiet bar where we'd have a nice glass of whiskey. But considering the fact that we probably need to keep this a bit above board, and we're probably trying to inspire more so than to get too much into the muck, I'd probably just say, hey, let's meet at a nice coffee shop. Typical American, I will take my coffee black, thank you.
Well, I'll go either way, but as we haven't had yet a guest who wants a whiskey, I would love to lean on that and raise a metaphorical glass to cheers you in and start you off. When was the last time you used pen and paper?
I usually use pen and paper for creative work just about every day. It might be sketching, but actually a lot of the time, because I spend so much time looking at a screen and looking at images, a lot of my creativity is actually writing. I actually find better ways of getting ideas out, more from let me write it down and think it out than necessarily having to go straight into the sketch phase. Sometimes I get myself a little too boxed in if I'm already jumping to a visual. But yeah, pen and paper just about every day.
And is there something for you about that physical act that is sort of transmittive?
Yeah,
it's even a word.
It's for a couple of different, a few different reasons. One, just in terms of how I learn things or how I register things, I always register it best if I am hearing it plus writing it down. Preferably I'm putting an action to it. So the physical bit of writing it down, it's a combination of it's not just going through my mind, it's actually going through my body and turning into something that's being remembered on a few different levels. Or just, in terms of where my creativity comes from, it's, I consider myself a sensual creative, not in terms of anything sexy, but in terms of the actual meaning of the word, which is taking in the senses and all levels. So sitting there and having something tactile, definitely to kick off a process. Or if I'm really kind of in a point where I'm stuck, I find working with pen and paper helps get me more unstuck than sitting there and looking something up on Google. Google might help a little bit, but sometimes I just need to sit back away from where I feel pressured to create, to let things kind of stew a bit. And so pen and paper is so removed from the screen and tactile, just it allows a few different ways for me to kind of engage with creative thinking and creative output. Yeah, so that's probably why I do that.
It makes perfect sense, and it resonates for me as well. I do think there is, especially when I'm feeling a scramble of overwhelm with a million things going on in my head at once, just that act of sitting down and writing it all out as a list. There's something sort of freeing about that. There's a release in getting it out, much like saying something out loud that you're worrying about. We have a tendency to sort of trap things away inside us, and if there's a physical release that we can do, it's really helpful. That being said, what's your go-to, pen or pixel?
It really depends on what I'm doing. In terms of, if I'm trying to do something where I'm doing maybe a creative piece of work that is, I don't know, more of an extension of something that's already been done, it's a small evolution, or it's working out, because, once you get up into management leadership, you're doing a lot less with actual pixels in terms of pushing stuff around in Figma or Photoshop or whatever your tool of choice is. You're doing more in spreadsheets and all the rest of it. It really depends on what part of the process or what area I'm either being asked to look at or I'm choosing to kind of delve into. I would say generally in terms of my preferred is offline, in terms of when I'm doing proper idea generation, when I'm doing blue sky thinking, or if I'm really trying to think of something a little bit more innovative. I think there's often, as you well know, there's a lot of copying of creativity from other people in our industry. I find with a lot of people who probably started their careers purely on computer and really have that as their basis and that sort of thing, especially with, social media being kind of already firmly in place when they've started their career. There can be a lot of just chasing other people's ideas and just trying to integrate that. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of really great stuff that you can find and riff on. And I'm not disparaging that at all. But for me personally, where I've tend to find innovation is more in the in the physical world. So it's easier for me to detach with a pen and paper and go out into the physical world and get some new ideas than necessarily looking at a computer and trying to be like, I need to come up with something innovative. And I'm just surrounded by stuff that other people have made. That is within my discipline. Versus if I'm out in the real world, I'm looking at a whole bunch of different disciplines that are solving slightly similar problems, but just I need to make that connection in some sort of analogy or some sort of follow through to be like, oh, okay, well, here's how you make a transition. Well, this is how a door opens. They've done something interesting with the hinge, or or they've done something different with a doorknob and that sort of thing. Does that give me ideas on different ways to transition screens or to get and have that sort of opening experience? Does that prompt anything? So yeah, it just really depends on, what end of the sphere I'm working on and which discipline I'm needing to engage my brain.
I love that. And I love, like, it feels very similar to something that I experience, which is when I'm trying to think of a way to achieve something as in terms of a design solution. Often I'll find the solution when I'm not thinking directly about the problem. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like for you, when you go outside and you see, like you say, a door moving or a different way they've hinged the door or whatever it might be, you're not sort of necessarily directly thinking about the challenge that is in front of you. You're just taking in inspiration and ideas and concepts from the world around you. And pulling that in. Does that sort of resonate to how it works for you?
Yeah, and in fact, this is something, with a couple of teams I've run, when we've had any sort of luxury or any, I don't even want to say luxury, when we've actually made room to sit there and work on, I guess, not just design governance, but also just, creativity governance, as the case would be, or, really kind to try to create spaces for people to kind of think outside of just their day-to-day. I'll have given them challenges that are related to design, but my stipulation is you are not allowed to use a search engine for this or AI or the rest. You have to go out into the real world. So, but I won't tell them what it's really kind of about outside of, there might be some that are pretty direct. I did this when I was working at hotels.com, part of Expedia. As I asked my team, it's like, okay, well, what I want you to do this weekend is just spend a couple hours, go into your local high street and just take photos of shop windows. And just come back and tell me which ones you thought were really good and which ones you thought were really bad and tell me why. And so they come back and show, and they would have like, oh, this is great because it does this, this, and this. And, oh, the imagery is really arresting, or, they're really good at cramming a whole bunch of stuff into a space, but making it interesting. And this one was really bad because it looked cheap, or, there was just nothing had a theme, or, it just looked very functional. And I'm like, okay, great. This is your homepage. How are they ordering information? How are they sitting there and trying to attract somebody to come into a store? Because, you can have as many promotions as you want on. If, you're looking at the front of the store and it's like, great, they have something for 9p, but you're just like, I don't want anything in the store. That sort of thing. It makes all the difference in the world. And a lot of that was to try to get them out of just, looking for everything online, because everybody can find what they're finding online. Go get inspiration from something else.
I think that's really important. I mean, when you think about, yes, we have design trends and therefore patterns will emerge, and we'll see similarities between this site and that site and this site, or this experience or that product. But I think when homogeny across all of that becomes so close and becomes so repeated that we lose a little excitement, certainly as creatives looking at it. But I think also as consumers or users, depending on what the experience is, one thing that we're often as creatives trying to create is a moment of joy that elicits an emotional response. And when those moments of joy are exactly the same each time, they lose their power. And so I love that idea. I love that task that you set your team of sending them out without the sort of full context to really think laterally about, how do I pull this together? How do I promote something in a way that is different, that is engaging? I mean, you walk down pretty much any high street and it's the same thing over and over again. So it's a perfect example. I'd love to kind of swerve, have a look. If you could take us from your very first role, might not necessarily have been creative, and then just bullet point your way through to the point where you first had a leadership position, and then bullet point your way from there to where you are now.
Okay, let me see if I can this as quickly as I can. So I've had a very serpentine sort of career. I'm not going to do anything that's kind of career related, even though that could be very interesting. I was, long and short of it, I've done quite a few things, including I used to teach horseback riding to children. I taught rock climbing to children. I used to work for a florist that only did big events and weddings. And I've done a bunch of stuff pre-actually graduating uni and kind of getting into my career. My very first role was as a multimedia designer back in the Mesozoic in e-learning in Dublin, Ireland. I went straight from uni in the States to there. I lucked out in terms of getting a visa. And that was very interesting in terms of like it was a job that was not just design, but it was also doing the programming as well, installing the software, doing audio and video editing, animation, the whole lot. So it was the full breadth of creating stuff. So from there, I went back to the States during the whole .com boom, worked for a few startups. One of them is still around, snapfish.com, and mostly worked in kind of the infancy of product design. It was just website design at the time. When the .com bubble burst, that's when I shifted over into advertising and mostly started off in digital advertising almost exclusively when I started off at Publicis in Seattle, but then that swiftly turned into 360 advertising. So doing art direction and design for TV, print, digital, outdoor, guerrilla, the whole lot, which was really great because that was very much an exercise in storytelling. How do you get people involved? How do you sit there and, create a whole ecosystem? What do you have behind it? How are you reinforcing a brand? So it was really, really helpful in terms of getting that grounding in storytelling and really thinking about how are you engaging the user or the customer. From there, I went to another agency called McKinney & Silver, which was based in North Carolina. There, it was still predominantly digital, but was doing some 360 advertising as well. That was kind of an introduction to brand in a more traditional sense. I'd done some graphic design throughout my career, but this was really kind of working with an agency that was really trying to reconstruct a few brands. So we had won a whole lot of Sony work, everything but PlayStation. PlayStation's the fun bit. We got most of everything else, and they were kind of redoing not necessarily the logo, but how the brand was being presented. So that was one example. From there, I went to New York, worked for Razorfish, which then got bought out by Sapient. From there, I was working in their advertising end of the business, and then I really started to work very closely with some of the designers that were doing product design as well. So it was kind of a mix of things. That was where I got exposure to some really great clients, including Victoria's Secret and some exposure to the TED conference as a client. So it was really good to kind of work with them and be around some really, really kind of inspirational people. From there, that's when I moved over to the UK. And then I basically kind of contracted at quite a few different types of mostly advertising agencies. The first place I was at was mostly a direct mail based advertising agency, but they had digital as well. Ran the digital. That's about the time I started running teams. So I was a manager there and managed about 11 designers, 9 digital, 2 print, and really just kind of got myself into all of that in terms of not only learning to deliver and, create whatever I was doing hands-on, but really trying to learn how to develop a team of different disciplines, getting them all kind of working together, really trying to lay out like, here's our values, here's what we're trying to go for, and here's what we're trying to achieve. I went to another agency called ILN that was running a smaller team, mixture of print and digital, but they were very social media focused in the early days. We were sitting there doing a lot of things around creating corporate blogs and things along those lines. From there, I had a lot of freelancing in between. Throughout my career, I tended to do blocks of freelancing between perm gigs. This is a way that I choose to keep myself sharp because oftentimes if you're working at a particular company for a long period of time, you get sucked into what the company finds important and it may not be keeping up with the trends of what's going on in the industry because there's no budget, there's no interest, there could be a lot of restrictions. So I tend to freelance in between, if anything, just to be like, I need to upskill, quickest way to upskill. And so I had done a spate of a long stint of freelancing. And then I got my job at hotels.com, which is part of Expedia. So at that point in time, I was there for 2.5 years. And that was really working with taking a team from about 2-3 people up to about, I think it was about 14 before I left. And it was when they were really getting into expanding, how they were dealing with the website, which was kind of their main area of income. And then it swiftly shifted over into the iOS apps and learning how to manage all of that with quite a few different verticals within the product. First time really dealing with product management as a function and really getting into now at that point, user research being part of the game. And from there, once again, a little bit more freelancing. Won't bother you with that. Just odd projects, always fun. From there, I went to Just Eat. Just Eat, for those who may or may not know what that is, it's basically a food delivery service. It kind of coordinates all of that between your favorite local restaurants. It's now kind of widened that to kind of just general logistics. So You can also get groceries and a whole bunch of other stuff off of there. At the time I was there, they were going through a rebrand, and they were also kind of reshifting how the design team was working. They had had a lot of people who were working as UX UI hybrids. At that point, were growing in such a way they wanted to specialize. So they want UI designers, UX designers, and then somebody like me who had a lot of experience with brand and a global rebrand, because I'd been through that with hotels.com, to come in and help them ferry in their rebrand. And that was another case of kind of building up a team from a couple of people to, once again, roughly somewhere between 13 and 15 people by the time I left, and spanning that over a few offices and, different time zones and all the rest. And then from there, I took another break and I started up with the Racing Post. So for those of you who don't know what the Racing Post is, it is the preeminent horse racing newspaper in the UK. And I mostly went there because they were in a cycle where they were trying to really change how they were operating in the world. They had been very kind of print-based and they had digital assets, but they weren't really customer focused. They were not really seen as being, modern or competing in a lot of ways. So I was kind of brought in to elevate all of that, bring in some UX and UI rigor, because that wasn't, it wasn't really existing in any sort of formal way at that point. And then also to build up their UX research team. Pretty much all of the data they were dealing with, for the most part, was quant. So I was building the qual side of the business from the ground up and had to deal with all the resistance that comes with that. So fun. And then from there, I was there for nearly 5 years, and I took a bit of a break, and then started up at Gumtree. Gumtree, when I got there, they were definitely in a position where the company had been sort of stagnant for quite a few years, partially because eBay bought them and sort of starved them a bit because they were kind of competition. And then they were bought out by private equity and they had to detach, and they spent 18 months detaching, which means the product didn't move at all. So by the time I came in, they're like, we need to catch up. Can you help us do that? And then about 2 months in, they're like, oh yeah, by the way, we're selling the business. So everything's changed. So mostly I helped them kind of through, a sales transition and tried to work with the team in terms of how to navigate that, while they're also trying to get a brand new app out the door. Not enough people, not enough time, all that sort of stuff. The new owners came in October, and I'm sure they're going to do a great job. But at that point in time, I was like, I don't think they're going to need me in a few months. So I opted to leave and try to do something else.
Wow. And yeah, I can absolutely see, like you say, the serpentine journey there from all of them. So it makes perfect sense. And hi, if what you're hearing is resonating with you, where you are in your leadership journey right now, stay tuned until the end. I'll share details on how you can work directly with me to level up your creative leadership. When you think about all of those places, is there a moment in time that you would go back to you then, but knowing what you know now? And if there is, what would you say to yourself?
That's a good one. There is one. So I really enjoyed my time at hotels.com. I ended up leaving. I was made redundant. They were doing a purge of a lot of people at that point. So it may not have changed anything, even if I did go back and change my perspective. But one of the things I wish I'd handled better was we had had a change in management. And, as a leader, it was still kind of, I don't want to say new-ish. I was new-ish at it because I was there from 2011 to 2013. We're now 12 years beyond that. I was fiercely loyal to my team and defended them to the hilt and wanted to make sure that they were taken care of, but almost to the point where I wasn't really taking on board what new management wanted to do. And that hurt me, definitely, but it also kind of hurt my team. So knowing now, it's like I would have probably been a little bit more open, try to build those relationships up a little bit better. And I know I'm not the only one who's fallen into that trap of like, there's new ownership and you're like, why can't it just be like it was? Why are you changing things? It's like, well, management's going to do what management's going to do. So you either get on board or you leave. So I think that's the one thing I would probably take back, because there was a lot that was good with the company. It wouldn't have been the same if I'd stayed, but it could have been better than, it could have been better if I'd handled it better, if you put it that way.
I think many of us who have been in leadership positions in design have had that moment, that huge organizational shift. There are sort of two possible routes or two possible healthy outcomes to that. One is you find genuine alignment with the new style, the new culture, the new management, or you realize this is not my path and it's time for me to find what the next challenge is or the next opportunity is. But that can be hard to see. in the middle of all of that, and especially when you're defending your team. And that phrase resonates so much with me, that idea of defending your team, that you are the first line of defense. That's a really powerful example. Thank you for sharing. You mentioned about, growing teams from sort of 2 to 3 people to like 14, 15 people.
Mm-hmm.
What was is there a sort of tried and tested route for doing that, or does it depend on company to company? And how have you gone about finding what works to do that growth?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's ever really a clean way of saying, hey, this is the thing you can cleanly replicate everywhere. It's like I liken it to utilizing agile. Like, can't implement it the same everywhere. It's the same thing with this. But there are certain sort of things to consider that are, like agile, certain things you can try to integrate one way or another. I think the biggest thing is first of all, it's just really getting into the heads of what is the business trying to accomplish? What are the other departments doing? How are they scaling? What are they taking on? Where is design research going to be helpful in terms of support, or going to be absolutely crucial? And then really starting to look at where is the design maturity of a company or research maturity of the company. So I'll take that into consideration for the last 2 roles I had when I was at Racing Post and then at Gumtree. It's the sort of thing of, depending on where that maturity is, that's also going to impact the desire to hire new heads. That's turning into any discipline, especially a discipline that they either don't know or don't really value yet. So I think the biggest thing is the more that you know of where the direction of the company is, what they're trying to achieve, and how the other kind of departments around you are what they're trying to do, that's really going to help inform okay, I'm definitely going to need somebody here. Do I need that person long-term or short-term? I don't know. Okay, well, if we don't think we're going to need this person after this project is done, this project's going to be done in 6 to 9 months. Probably best to get a contractor in, maybe see if we can convince them to stay if need be. If we are looking at that and saying, actually, well, if this project gets done, there's another one behind it, that sort of thing. Fine, we need to get somebody in perm. I think the one thing that I have done is in kind of both companies, but definitely at Racing Post, because that was probably the biggest growth I did there. Less growth in Gumtree, more of a swap out. With there, it was because they weren't sure about qualitative UX research. I was like, okay, I'm going to bring in a contractor. For 6 months, I'm going to bring in somebody I know who I know is really good at this and is really, really good at relationships. She used to be a former recruiter. She could talk to anybody, that sort of thing. And I'm going to have her come in and we're going to discuss the projects that we need in terms of what we're seeing with insights. And we're going to use that as our opportunity to, one, both of us getting to know the product better, getting to know the users better, but also then bringing out insights that haven't been captured by the quant data and really, but trying to tie it into what they already know. And so that's a kind of a long description, but the biggest thing with that was starting off with contract in areas where they weren't used to having designer research. Those are the areas that I'd bring in contractors as okay, let's see what value we can bring here. And then this will help inform growth. And hopefully we can keep the person that's on. Otherwise, it's okay, well, at least now I know we've brought in this person with this skill at this level. I have a better idea of what we need. Might be somebody more senior, might be somebody more junior, somebody with different skill set, that sort of thing. But at this point, I'm not having to fire somebody or, take them through probation, because it's tough to have somebody not pass probation. And then, of course, there's plenty of new laws that are in effect, which makes it tougher to do so. So I find that to be a pretty good route to figuring out what you need if it hasn't already existed before, and use that as a proof of concept and build.
I love that, the idea of it's akin to a client project, right? First of all, understanding the landscape, understanding what the objective is, what's in place already, what gaps there are, what works well, but what gaps there are, and then finding the proof points to say, okay, well, let's test this metric, or let's push this boundary, and so bringing people in to 2 things. One, to test those, but also to prove the worth of that position, to prove the worth of having resource in that position, I think is really clearly a successful model.
It's actually a model I've used even for myself. I've had about 3 jobs where I've come in and I said well, okay, have you had this position before? No. Okay, how about you contract me for 6 months? Make sure you need this position at this level with me in it. Because if you haven't had it before, you don't really know what you need yet. And I find that's, that also gives peace of mind to a degree to the people you're coming into.
That's a great piece of advice. When you think about the current sort of landscape of the creative industries, and with tech emerging and evolving at such a rapid pace, it's having both a negative and a positive impact on all creative disciplines, all industries, but a big impact on all creative disciplines. So you have people coming into the creative industries, but you also have those that have been around for a long while, who've been out of work for a long while. So what advice would you give them, either the newbies coming in or the ones that have been around and have been out of work? Like that idea, the idea of sort of pitching in as, hey, bring me on as a contract, test me out, try me. But what other kind of avenues of advice would you give to those creatives?
Yeah, I think one of the things is, especially if you've been around a while, probably the biggest thing you can do is show that you're up on the tech, but also really show that you're open to ideas. And find a way to demonstrate like you have no problem getting your hands dirty. You know, some of the reasons why, plenty of people get rejected for having too much experience is because they are interviewing with managers who are much younger than them. Or, just less experienced in one way or another. And there is always, the threat or the concern that it's like, okay, well, this person's been around a while and they've like managed teams and like, are they just going to undermine me and make me look bad and all that sort of stuff? And hey, I've been guilty of it myself. And when, in some of my hiring where it's like, I don't want that person. I don't want to be challenged every day, because how they were coming across in the interview, regardless of the CV, was like, they would be very argumentative. And it's the sort of thing of, yeah, if you're really confident as a leader, you know where you are, you know the company really well, that may not be a problem, but I would say that, the creative industry in particular, we have a lot of people with confidence issues or insecurities or massive fragile egos. So, you have to realize what you're coming into and grappling with all of that. So I would say if you're more experienced, you really just need to kind of show that you're okay with just like being told what to do, if it comes to it. And, or if you have an objection, that you know how to deal with it tactfully and realize that even though this person is less experienced than you or younger than you, they're ultimately your boss. And you need to be able to transmit that like, hey, that's fine. I'm just here to do the work. I'm happy to be here. So I think that's one thing. And kind of to your point, finding ways of either freelancing or even just getting a placement, if you're in the financial position to do so, is also a good way to go. And I'll give an example for this is when I was at Racing Post, my head of research, he had a friend of his that he'd worked with before. They had both been in teaching, and his buddy was about to get laid off from being head teacher at a school. He's like, yeah, he really wants to transition into research. So I'd like to bring him in for like 3 months unpaid just as a placement so he could learn. And I was like, okay, well, fine. We needed more help with research anyways. We didn't have the funds for it. So it's just like, as long as like my boss is okay with it and we can get him the tech he needs, it's fine. And it turned out to be really great because he was well seasoned. I'd say he's probably about 5 or 6 years older than myself, and I'm no spring chicken. I had no problem with him in terms of him challenging in any way that I found threatening at all. Not at all. He was very open to everything. And also he loved the subject matter. So he was happy as anything to be sitting there being like, I get to research my favorite hobby. So I think if you can also show enthusiasm for like, I just really want to work in this thing because I've always wanted to like make this transition to this industry, that'll also help a lot, because then, the benefit of him is he's got all this background with working with a lot of different personalities and a lot of different ages. So he was great as a researcher to go out and do intercepts because he would just talk to anybody. No problem whatsoever. And, didn't take anything personally. And I didn't have to worry about that, which was great. So I would say if you're on that side of kind of like the experience, and those are some things to think about, is that enthusiasm, that, willingness to kind of get your hands dirty and to make sure that you realize what you may be coming up against in terms of, a manager that's less experienced than yourself, and just always be there to kind of, bolster what the team mission is. I would say if you're on the younger side, I think they're going to have a tougher time because of AI coming in and taking a lot of the tasks that you'd normally give a younger person. So I think more than anything else, with like the younger people kind of coming in, it's, what? The one thing those older farts aren't going to necessarily be up on is all the tools and all the ways you can use them. You're going to be learning a lot faster than all of them. So use all of that energy and all of that brain flexibility that you got as a 20-something versus somebody in their 50s to just learn all the things, like learn how to do the prompts, learn everything about the tools, learn everything about the competition. That'll help quite a bit. But I think it's also, really coming in with a wanting to learn mindset. In that same team, we had 2 placements, like university placements. And the best things about, those guys coming in was, first of all, a lot of great new energy. But, they were able to kind of take everything on board, learn, and just find a way to be autonomous. So it's like, okay, well, here's what we're trying to achieve. And the research manager or myself would give them a few sort of like, well, we need to go find out this. Okay, I'm going to go figure it out on my own, come back and get some feedback, and then, keep going, which was great. And they were both open to learn. And once again, to talk to people, zero problem with that. But they were also very, like, I was struck at how professional they were at 20 years old. I'm not saying that people that, of that age can't be, but, it was more professional than some people in their 30s at the company. So it was like, hey guys, good on you. They showed up on time. They rarely complained. They did what was requested of them. They challenged respectfully, and they asked questions. That's probably the biggest thing. I say learning the tools and trying to find some way of being of value on a human level, whether it's being able to be a good communicator or to, build relationships in a company is going to help anybody in the start of their career in spades. Actually, anybody, but definitely when you're first starting out.
It feels like the thread through all of those fantastic pieces of advice, but the thread through all of those is enthusiasm. Showing an enthusiasm, showing a passion, showing an energy. Mm-hmm. Energy maybe is a better word.
Yeah, and I think it's, I think that's important for anything because, not everybody loves their job. There's plenty of people who just kind of go through the motions and pick up a paycheck. As a manager, I'm kind of fine with some of my team doing that because not everybody can sit there and be like a rock star. Otherwise, I'd have a mutiny like every other week. Why haven't I been promoted? Why am I not getting this? And I think you need a good mix on a team in terms of like people who are really striving and people who are just like, hey, you know what? I've found my groove. It's all good. But regardless of whether or not you found your groove or you're striving, showing enthusiasm to the company mission, to the users, to your discipline, that's just going to help you out in spades because anybody who just comes across as only being in it for themselves, that's usually the person you cut first because you're just sort of like, great that you want to go ahead, but if you're going to do it while, stomping on these people or, disregarding the fact that you're on a team or really not caring about the mission, only really caring about your paycheck or your or how many people in the company know you and celebrate you. I mean, I don't have to say this seems fairly obvious, but you still run into people like that. So I think especially when you're in those outer areas, not within that kind of those prime sort of that prime bracket of employment years, which seems to be getting smaller and smaller, being genuinely enthusiastic about what you do will help you in spades.
And I think it also creates work that you have a sense of pride over, which brings me neatly to, I'd love to know when you think of all of the projects you've worked on, all of the places you've worked, what's a piece of work you're most proud of?
There's quite a few. I hate to do it. I hate to do this. I'm going to talk about Racing Post again, partially because nobody expects me to bring that up. But we had this rather massive piece of work called Project Janus. And basically it was a digital transformation. And there was a few different things kind of going on. They were upgrading the database that held all the horse racing data. They were also simultaneously trying to change the digital CMS that the editorial team and the news team were working on. All these things funneled into what came onto the website and the app. Where they were completely replatforming the products themselves, so taking them onto completely new code bases because the old code bases were so rickety. And they were also trying to put it on React so they didn't have to sit there and maintain so many different code bases. So all of these things are doing it all at once. The company hadn't really done this before. and this was probably about a year after I'd started building up my team and building up the research function. So one of the things that came into the objective was, okay, can we actually get the users involved in terms of how we're designing stuff? So we weren't able to do a complete overhaul. We just didn't have the scope of that. But in a sense, it was a mini overhaul. And what I mean by that is we couldn't really overhaul a ton of the journeys. There was a few select ones we could sit there and like, let's really actually reconfigure this whole journey. But we could look at various points within the journeys and be like, okay, we're going to redo this whole page, or we're going to redo this micro journey. And the reason why I kind of pulled that out was this gave me and my team an opportunity to actually engage with the company where like it hadn't had before. Design was sort of still, it was in a better position than when I had started, and research was in a better position in terms of, company sort of opinion of it, but there was still a lot of doubt. As a company that if you didn't come from betting or if you hadn't worked in horse racing for 20 years, you were a bit suspect. And like majority of my team and I did not come from either. But, kind of the thing I kept telling everybody, it's like a problem is a problem, a user problem is a user problem. Context is great. Subject matter knowledge is all, helpful, but it shouldn't restrict us from actually doing stuff because the whole company is filled with subject matter experts. I don't need to be a subject matter expert. You'll tell me when I'm doing it wrong. I'm here to plumb your minds to figure out how to do that. So during that year up until we started that project, I had been doing a lot of work of like building up relationships with a lot of the departments. And that included commercial and marketing and brand and editorial and all the rest. Who hadn't really been talking to each other before, especially with product for a while. So one of the things we did was, I worked with the team to be like, how do we want to handle this? We're going to have a ridiculous amount of scope and more stakeholders than we know what to do with because everybody's going to want a piece of this. How do we handle this? How do we get through all of this? So we ended up doing rolling design sprints. So which I would never advise anybody long-term. This ended up going longer term than we expected. But the whole point of that was so that we had a structure to automatically get research and at a minimum validation, like desk research and validation in there. So there was more user interaction than how they typically put products through before. But it also gave us an opportunity to really work with the stakeholders and build trust with them so that they could see our process and start to trust us a bit that like, yes, we do know what's going on. We are talking to you. We do want your opinions. Here's what we're up against in terms of things that we can and cannot do, either in terms of what makes sense from a user point of view or technical restrictions or whatever. It allowed them to kind of see the user testing so that they could actually get into the minds of the users. There were plenty of people who thought they knew the users, and mostly they knew the users either from old data or from people shouting at them on Twitter. And it's like, that's not necessarily a representation of how people actually use these products day to day. And one of the biggest issues that we kind of went into this with was how to monetize the users, because a lot of the users that the company had prized the most, and were probably the ones who were buying the newspapers, but not the ones who we could monetize in any way on the digital platform. So they already had their way of betting. They already have been signed up to their bookmakers. They're not going to take a subscription if they get all this data for free, all that sort of stuff. So we were really trying to work with the company in terms of like, we know you guys like these guys over here and they're good for some stuff in terms of monetization of subscriptions, but not a whole lot else. You need to start looking at these people in the middle who are not experts, and you really need to find a way to start getting the novices in. It was a massive project with lockdown that threw everything, a spanner into everything. And so it dragged out for much longer than it should have, all that sort of stuff. But, every sprint, and the sprints were, basically 15 days in the end. So we had 10 days of sprint and then 5 days of resolution, which is here, deal with all the edge cases, deal with that, updating the design system, etc. Do the pre-research for the next sprint. It was a massive project, but we got to, like, each sprint we got to work with a slightly different a different area of the business. So we'd have one sprint was like entirely like, you got to go talk to editorial. This one's about tipping. You got to go talk to tipping. This one's like, we got to figure out where we're going to put the ads, go talk to commercial, all that sort of stuff. And really working with tech and some of the outside vendors in terms of how they were trying to implement things so we could stage out the designs. Here's where we're trying to get to. Here's what we need to do now. And then going through the beta testing and all the rest of it. So it was a massive project. The team grew and shrank, just flexed during that whole time because it took about 3 years to do. But by the end of it, it fundamentally changed how the company was working with design research in particular, and really kind of said research as being very crucial to kind of really understanding how to go forward with new product features or new ways of dealing with product, especially incidentally in our B2B side of the business, which dealt with the bookmakers directly. And really kind of built up the designers as being less seen as pixel pushers, which is kind of how they were seen when I started, to being like, okay, these are problem solvers, and really kind of crucial to like getting out what we're trying to do. So I think, probably I'm unhealthily attached to that project, partially because it was so much of my life, but it was also, it just changed things so profoundly in terms of relationships and ways of working and knowledge in the company and all of that. So it's also kind of dear to my heart in that way.
It sounds like a fantastic design jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
And it feels like there was a lot of education that you needed to facilitate, either in your own understanding of different, or yours and your team's understanding of different areas of the business, but also helping those areas of the business understand their place within the wider organization, and then understanding your customers, the users, and the differentiation between those that are sort of old school traditional media and then that are difficult to monetize digitally and so on. It feels like it wasn't necessarily about finding the jigsaw pieces from just a design or a user or a UX perspective. It was the whole thing. So UX, service design, like organizational structure, like the whole thing, which sounds fascinating. And it makes perfect sense then that becomes one that you go to. And if it was in the middle of lockdowns, a time when so much was up in the air and so much was being questioned, so I would imagine to have such a pivotal project to navigate whilst we were also globally all navigating this weird, completely new time that we'd not experienced before.
I also had about a third of my team put on furlough as well. So I had to pick up tools, and that was fine. But I'm sure I probably pissed off some of the people minding the asset library. I'm like, I just got to get this done.
Detach component.
Exactly. There's a lot of that. I'd be like, you guys figure out how to add this to the system, but here you go.
Yeah. That's a wonderful work project you're proud of. What's something that you're proud of outside of work?
Outside of work. See, this is a work conversation. You're going to have to edit out all this dead space as I think about this. I think more than anything else is I'm proud of that I still have a lot of creative endeavors that are not digital. So I'll still do some painting from time to time, like canvas painting with acrylics. I'll have spates of like generating like 4 or 5 canvases and then not touch it for 18 months, that sort of thing. I mentioned before, like, one of my jobs was working at a florist. So I'll do kind of floral arrangements for friends of mine who, they're doing weddings or they're doing a party or something along those lines. And then, my biggest thing that I pretty much about 3 or 4 companies know me for is I bake. I call it stress baking, that sort of thing. But, I get to experiment a bit. Most people, those companies know me for baking and making cocktails because when I was going through uni, yes, I studied design, but I had actually started off in pre-veterinary. And I did a double major to start, which was pre-veterinary and political science, which have nothing to do with design directly, but helpful all the same. So I kind of call baking and cocktailing an extension of the sets of courses I started off with pre-veterinary, because you start off with a mountain of chemistry. So I was like, it's chemistry you can eat. So it allows me to kind of geek out and be creative at the same time. And also it's a point of connection because I can't have all this stuff in my house and eat that. And I can't have it with the people who live in the house with me because they'll hate me too. So incidentally, during lockdown, when we were in the UK, only allowed to go out for about an hour a day, or, if you went out anywhere, it was like, oh, it's the grocery store or, the pharmacy, or you could sit there and pick up takeaway coffee. I got to know a few people at the coffee shops real well and started being like, I know you guys are working hard and this isn't easy. Do you want some pound cake? Here you go. And I just kept going. So, there's still coffee shops near where I live who get my yields about every other weekend. It's fine. Keeps me in free coffee.
There's nothing wrong with free coffee. And I love the idea of baking and then the tagline, it's chemistry you can eat. I love that. I think that needs to be if it's not already some kind of knitted concoction on Etsy, I think it absolutely needs to be there.
It's going to be part of my cookbook. It's fine.
All right. This has been a really enlightening talk. I have one final question, and it's the same final question that I ask every single guest. Are you, Charmaine, still awaiting approval?
I'm guessing this is one of those Rorschach tests. Like, what do you mean by that? If I'm waiting for approval by the industry, no. I'm kind of like, I am who I am. I know what I'm good at. That doesn't mean I'm not open to sitting there and learning more and finding new things and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of the industry itself, you get what you see. And as I said before, I've got no problem expanding. I just really want to learn. I want to continue to learn from people who are, curious about not just design, but everything, not just research, but just like, hey, you know what? Give me something from the side that has nothing to do with design, because that'll spark something in me that will lead to something visual at some point. So, from the industry, no. For myself, always. Isn't everybody always still sitting there waiting for approval of themselves, by themselves? Yeah, no more than anybody else. So that's going to be my answer.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is your opportunity. How can people get in touch with you? What do you want to promote? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, so I would like to say that I'm all over the socials and that sort of thing, but I am on LinkedIn, so you can find me on there, Charmaine Wyland. And yeah, I think more than anything else is I'm always open for a discussion about anything interesting about design or thinking about, a customer experience or the importance of really kind of embracing the human side of what we're doing with design. I think with what's going on with AI, I really kind of worry that things are going to get very impersonal very quickly, but I think it will snap back into where designers and researchers really provide their value is like, where's the human connection again? How do we bring that in? And I really love talking about those sorts of scenarios and that sort of thing. So yeah, best way to get a hold of me at this point is LinkedIn. I am on Instagram, but that has nothing to do with work. So that's it for now. I'm sure I'll expand at some point, but at this point I'm like, I've got too much bacon to do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, Charmaine. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, lovely to chat with you too. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Awaiting Approval. If you're a creative leader or stepping into a leadership position and want support that's honest, practical, and tailored to you, I'd love for you to come and join my Supercharged Creative Leaders program. It's a 4-week course built around 8 pre-recorded modules, 4 live sessions with me and the rest of your cohort, a private Slack space for you to ask questions and go deeper together, plus ongoing access to my alumni community once you complete the course. Each cohort is capped at just 6 people, so you'll always get personal attention, real feedback, and space to grow. And if you want to tailor the journey further, you can book extra one-to-one sessions with me, and we can dig deeper into the challenges you're facing right now. I built this program based on everything I wish I'd known when I started leading creative teams. No fluff, no jargon, just the tools, frameworks, conversation, and clarity that will actually move you forward. Spots go quickly, so if this sounds like the right fit for you, go to growwithadamjennings.com to book your place on the next cohort. Previous attendees have gone on to win major pitches, land new roles, get promoted, and step into leadership with more clarity, confidence, and purpose. You can find out more and book your place on the next cohort at growwithadamjennings.com. I can't wait to start working with you.
Awaiting Approval is a Cordial Fox production, hosted by Adam Jennings, produced by Adam Jennings and Jasmine Egner.